Hello there, everyone. My name is Mohammed, and welcome back into another episode of the podcast, Enlighten. Today, our guest is Gien Wong. James is a co-founder of Stop Press Go, a global citizens collective focusing on sense-making and developing scalable, bottom-up, rapid whole system change. He is also an action researcher in the Commons, focusing on Commons leverage points, including inner transformation, outer transformation, and the tight coupling between the two. He has a background in electronics, communication, circuit board design, and industrial control system technology, but migrated toward nonlinear, social-ecological system intervention design with a special focus on leverage points, even resources, and social tipping points, with the drawing of the crisis humanity faces in the Anthropocene. James, thank you for coming on the show. Great to have you.
It's my pleasure.
So there is a lot of interesting topic about sustainability, and I would like to get the other side of the perspective of some expert people who, such as you, who are trying to manage to control or to understand these overly complex issues, whether on local or on the global scale. And I have several questions for you. Mm-hmm. So the first question that I want to ask, what do you see as the most promising ways to resolve the many challenges the world faces today?
Well, that's quite a big question. It's a one simple question, but it's loaded. It's got so many dimensions to it, complexity, right? So, you know, I think that there are many different. It's like a network of answers, because there's no one silver bullet or one unique solution. I think it's going to be a multitude of solutions that all work together in a network. And I think the nature of the problem we face is that I often refer to it as a polycrisis. So it's not one crisis, it's multiple crises of many different dimensions. So it has to be, you know, it's a wicked problem and a social mess, which are characterized by having no solution in reality. So we can do our best to mitigate it, and I think that's the best we can do. And as the latest news that we've seen in the scientific communities indicating, we're getting very, very close to tipping points, and very, very close to points where 1.5 degrees Celsius global mean temperature is going to be transgressed. And so there's a lot of different variables at work. And I think, I mean, personally, coming from the Commons and having done a lot of sense making, I think that the top-down actors, like the big business and government actors, have a lot of put a lot of work and effort into their solutions already. And that's kind of like a traditional mainstream approach. But I think there's a lot of potential in the bottom-up movement, in citizens, in the billions of ordinary citizens around the world who feel frustrated by the slow degree of progress. I think there's a leverage point there that we can tap into, which my hope is that by tapping into the leverage point, we're not like we're currently dragged by the slow moving force of the top-down actors. I think the bottom-up actors can actually drive the top-down actors to the speed that's required. So that's kind of where my sense making and my action research has led me to feel that there's a great potential for ordinary citizens to be engaged.
Okay, yeah, can't agree more. We need a collective approach, and also I believe that what we need to achieve global sustainability is we need to have a global overview, but again, the actions need to be orchestrated at the local level. And so I think this is the most interesting thing.
Across all scales. Across all scales.
Yeah, totally. So my second question is linked to the previous one. So you are talking about transformation on a civilizational scale, and it's already happening, but not fast enough. What ideas emerged out of your sense-making to accelerate the process already taking place?
I think that we have many different silos of actors. Once again, many different dimensions, many different scales, but there's kind of a lack of coordination between all these actors. And I think that's going to hurt us in the end, because if we cannot coordinate, if certain school of bottom-up actors are saying, this is the solution, and we're going for it, and then you have top-down actors saying, no, this is the solution, we're going for it. And you have all these different silos working towards their solutions, but nobody's talking to each other. You're somewhere along the way, you're going to get stranded assets. You're going to get some solutions which are tried, which are going to get left behind because nobody's coordinating. And not only that, you're going to get wasted resources. People not coordinating together. You're going to get some parties are going to be wasting all their effort. So that synchronization is really a key issue, to synchronize across multiple scales, multiple dimensions. And I think Donella Meadows, one of the original authors of the Limits to Growth, in her body of research on leverage points, she pointed out that the shift in worldviews, paradigms, and value systems is one of the most, if not the most, critical leverage point of all. However, as certain research has shown, that leverage point is quite slow moving. It takes in the order of decades to get shifts in paradigms and worldviews. But we feel that there are ways to accelerate that so that it doesn't take decades, but could take years. But that requires a very unique kind of intervention. Yeah.
I can't agree more. So my third question is, why do you think that downscaling the planetary boundaries framework is vital to achieving local, regional, and hence global sustainability?
I think that, first of all, I would like to say that there are those who believe that it cannot be done. It's debatable, because of the complexity of it. And there are those who are already attempting that in different ways. I believe that it would be useful from a sociological perspective in order to mobilize the citizens of the planet. Because I think there's a psychological factor at work here that's holding people back from committing to it. There are a number of psychological factors, including tribalism and people adhering to their own tribe's perspective of what's going on, what the story is. As for instance, in the political left and the political right schism in the world. But there's also this inherent psychological limitation of human beings, because Professor Timothy Morton coined the word hyperobject to describe objects which are beyond our human sensory apparatus's ability to sense. And climate change is one of these hyperobjects. You can't actually see climate change when you look into the world. You can't feel it or touch it. It's this climate change is this whole complex theoretical model which aggregates all, millions of observations from around the world to explain what's happening to us at the local level, right? But if we can disaggregate that, those parameters at the global level, which we cannot sense, into action items that we can feel we can achieve in our own communities, right? If within our own communities, we say that we're gonna have a healthier community, a community that is basically premised on well-being for all, including economics that's equitable for all, and biophysical parameters, which are within the health of our local communities, that ensure that we have agriculture that that sustainable agriculture is guaranteed for the future, and all the natural resources of our local community are going to be there, preserved for the local community in the future. Then those are aspects that we can all sense and we can all feel through the economy, as an example. So if we can localize those large, grand parameters, we can then appeal to people in the local communities to become. We can make it meaningful to them, and if it's not meaningful to them, the chances of them being mobilized and motivated to act will be quite low.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the key, to motivate people on a mass scale. We have to make these things meaningful, speak their language.
Oh yeah, totally. So on the lower level of policymaking and of action, how is your startup contributing in tackling climate change? What has been done and what is on the agenda?
Okay, well, we've been in the sense-making mode for a long time, and we're in a sense, we're now entering the stage where we've done sufficient sense-making to emerge a strategy that we think is feasible. And the strategy involves a kind of a matrix of transformation that includes inner transformation and outer transformation, as well as individual transformation and collective transformation. So you take those variables, you get a 2x2 matrix, and we feel that all 4 of those quadrants play a significant role, a critical role in this transformation process. And what we are trying to do is we're trying to look at that 2x2 transformation matrix and emerge open source tools for the planet that everyone can use. So at the individual scale, the inner individual scale, so that they can address the worldviews, the paradigms, the value systems, the individual kind of behavioral or outer aspect, so that they can, once they experience that shift in the inner world, they can then act on that as an individual and make social transformation through behavioral change at their own local level. And then basically a duplication of that to the collective level. So collective inner transformation, where millions or billions of people are undergoing that transformation. And then the collective action that emerges out of that internal change of millions of people or billions of people. So our strategy is to kind of create a praxis, an open praxis for humanity that all of humanity can contribute to, and which can be integrated into individuals' lives, communities' lives, and any larger organizations' lives.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great to hear. And my final question is, currently, artificial intelligence is being used a lot in media and also in research. And it is currently reshaping our modern era. So how do you think that artificial intelligence can be utilized to foster the implementation of sustainable development goals at a planetary scale?
Okay, maybe before answering that, just go back to the previous question to just point out the 2 different praxis that we're working on, the 2 different programs for the inner transformation and the collective outer transformation. And because that's where we see the AI being used. So that would answer that question. So the inner transformation program we call we've named Deep Humanity. So it's an open source praxis that we are developing, which will assist, take individuals through a journey to discover the deeper aspects of their humanity. And that's important because we feel that's where the rapid shift in the internal reference system, the world views and the paradigms and the value systems is going to occur through this deeper education of what it means to be a living and dying human being. So we're envisioning an application that would go along with that called a Transform app, which would then help the individual to undergo that the individual can use to monitor their own transformation process, their inner transformation process, and then also to monitor their outer or behavioral transformation process. And AI can be used there to assist with that. So in both cases, we see that AI can be used to assist humans to perform activities much more efficiently, or even make it possible, whereas if the AI was not there, it would not be feasible at all. Okay, but we do not see AI as being the controller or the thing that determines what happens, because to me that is a dangerous kind of situation which we have not as a society really thought out fully yet. But AI, certainly AI that can handle a lot of the things, the cognitive loads that human beings have problems with, because it's designed that way. It can, that's definitely a positive application of AI. And then the other praxis for the collective transformation is we're planning to implement a festival called the Tipping Point Festival around the globe, which will be a vehicle to plant the seeds in communities all around the world of this change that we need. And so for us, the reason for that is because the community is the building block for the social transformation that we see that comes from the bottom. Because that's the community is the kind of logical size where you have enough people to actually make concrete action, but not so many people that you're paralyzed by decision making. So the community is the scale that we're targeting for collective change. And at that level, we see that AI can be used in multitude of ways to assist in disaggregating the planetary boundaries, which are very complex, disaggregating that to a community level so that it makes sense to say that this community, if they have this target of their planetary boundaries and their donut economic parameters, if they can reach meeting those targets for their fair share of that global allocation, if they bend the curve for that community, then effectively when you aggregate all the efforts of all the communities around the world, then you can bend the curve for the whole planet. So we see AI playing a really critical role for doing that, because we're envisioning millions of working groups, and to be able to coordinate the discoverability of new ideas and sharing them and facilitating high efficacy conversations and the interventions that have to be modeled and tested, and to be to test that ensure that those models are accurate and that they don't result in unintended consequences themselves. That's going to be a process that's going to be highly complex, and I think beyond the means of human beings to do alone. So it's going to be a combination of human intelligence and machine intelligence in order to handle that level of complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I can argue or comment on one thing you have said, you have talked about how AI can be utilized in order to disaggregate the planetary boundaries at planetary scales. And I have one idea. We know that sustainability is composed of 3 dimensions: environmental, economic, and social, that they are moving in a time frame. But again, the current planetary boundaries are only focusing on environmental aspects, parameters.
Yes.
So what's your position regarding this? So in the major sense, overall, the current planetary boundaries cannot express nor capture sustainability. So what's your position regarding this? And also, is it possible to enlarge the concept of planetary boundaries to include other societal and economic parameters? But again, my idea is that how can AI help in creating other parameters, knowing that we don't have data on a fine scale level? So for me, is AI can actually generate data for such parameters, and then we can utilize back as inputs into the global planetary boundaries framework.
I think that's an excellent observation. Of course, the planetary boundaries are currently biophysical in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we as human beings are a part of nature, and the transition it doesn't make sense to undergo a transition without the human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So of course, the economic considerations and social considerations are critical. So that means that the disaggregating the planetary boundaries is important, because to understand what those biophysical, how do we get that down to the community level and make it a fair share, equitable distribution, so that communities, geographic communities, or people in general can say that this is my fair share of what I have to do. But then I think that's where the donut economics framework comes into play, because it is basically, the donut economics is the planetary boundaries on the outside, and the biophysical impacts of socio-economic activities of human beings on the inside. And the donut economics is essentially saying that we have to keep the biophysical impacts of our socio-economic activities under that limit, that hard limit of the biophysical planetary boundaries. So I think that when we disaggregate the planetary boundaries to the community scale, of course, you have to then include the socio-economic variables as well. So that donut economics has to be at the community scale as well to go along with it. Then you pointed out about, I suppose, modeling, using AI to model data. I think that is definitely a promising approach, because the data, as you know, doesn't exist. Like the high granularity data does not exist to allow disaggregation at the at a granular level that's accurate. But if we can model it using, say, economic data, and we can get a close enough approximation based on that, then at least that can give us some kind of starting target that communities can aim for. That's roughly in the right area. And you could, if you add error bounds to it, then that's reasonable to me, right? Because you need something at the local level that makes sense, that can help a community to consolidate, that can bring the community together, say, let's collectively hit that target, right? So that gives them a reason to come together, and knowing that if they do it and all the other communities do it, that gives them hope that we're doing our share. This is within the realms of what I can do, and if I do my bit, then everybody else can do their bit. I mean, right now, people are kind of doing that. People are, whatever silo of society people are in, whether it's in steel making, cement making, building, construction, architecture, food production, transportation, all these organizations and people and actors are trying to become sustainable, right? But what is the danger is that if we don't have a sensible target for what is sustainable, how are we going to reach that? How are we going to stay under 1.5 degrees, right? So, I mean, there are other scientists have come up with other simple formulas to do this, you know. So I think we have to look at all of that and compare and see what makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's really about motivating people to accelerate the change.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think one of the most promising approaches is using ABMs, which is agent-based modeling incorporated with artificial intelligence algorithms to capture the cultural, the social, and economic behaviors of people, of societies across the world. And I think this is fascinating, and maybe we should explore this in our project.
I think that that's a good point, because I think that when you make assumptions that do not include cultural assumptions, when you have models that do not assume cultural differences, you're going to get data that's results that are quite different.
Yeah.
Not expected. Doesn't match reality, right? I think, well, I had one question, Mohammed. I don't know what your thoughts are, but what do you feel about the production side, consumption side responsibilities in this context of system change? You know, producers of industry, the producers of materials that we all consume as consumers. So if we disaggregate at the community level, then how do we allocate responsibility to producers who are sometimes they're in our communities, but often you have a lot of producers who are multinational, transnational organizations, very centralized. So how does one include them in such a system?
Well,
how do we account for that?
Yeah, well, if we try to know what has been established in the literature, in the scientific literature review, over decades, we are trying to allocate responsibilities to producers, but we can't actually get anything out. And for me, or what we believe in, we think that the only solution or maybe the key for such change is to allocate responsibilities to final consumers. And so eventually the consumers can choose and can change the behavior of the global supply chains, and then put a great burden on the producers to shift their production paradigm. So this is my major idea.
And as you know, that there's in the scientific research, there is a recent trend towards looking at consumption-based footprints and responsibility. But on the other hand, you have these arguments that you know, people often say, oh, well, a single individual can't do much, right? You see that, okay, the person's recycling and they're not taking as many trips. So that's kind of the argument. So you know, those people would argue that you actually have to go after the Exxons of the world in order to make the change, because they're the ones who are the central producers, and they're the ones drilling for the oil and so on. So what can the individual do against them? So well, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, on the long run, I think if we stopped consuming the output or the product of a given company, then over time, the company will have to change the product per se. And change the product per se, they need to change several parameters in the production process. So this is the main idea of consumption-based accounting, is to empower the final consumers to make great efforts and great burdens on the producers.
I think I agree with your strategy, because that's, in a sense, the Stop, Reset, Go bottom-up movement is all about that. But I think where we see there's a leverage point is that in the past, there hasn't been the knowledge to know how to aggregate individuals at scale. So it's always been kind of a fluffy, very vague kind of messaging to say, oh, if you just recycle, you're doing your part. But there needs to be precise kind of scientific evidence to support that if this percentage of people did it, or this number of communities did, you will have this impact, right? And that will cause a major scalable shift. So we feel that the billions of people on the planet, if we can mobilize them and actually come up with the scientific evidence through research to show that if that many people took this action, that's within their realm of possibilities, within their choice architecture, that they can actually do it. It's not some far off dream, but it's something within what they can do. It's their reality. Then they can have that impact. Then I think that's empowering, because people want to participate when they can actually have an impact. If they can't have an impact, they feel helpless and powerless, right? And so that's where I guess that's where we see there's a missing opportunity right now for that. Yeah. Because the top-down actors are doing the best they can, but I think there's room at the bottom to do more, to do a lot more.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was such a great experience. I believe this is the end for the podcast, for the episode. Thank you, James, for being with us today. Extremely grateful to have you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
You are most welcome.